Welcome to Sunday Ripple. I'm Rob Anderson. Each week we explore scripture and the ripples it can create on our everyday lives. Sometimes we're going to reflect on Sunday's message. Sometimes we'll dive into other passages that speak to where we are. Whether you're a Christian or just tuning in for a thoughtful conversation, this podcast is here to help you reflect and grow and keep the message moving through your week. Let's get into it. There are some legends every small town holds on to. Fish stories, local heroes, and those mysterious figures who strike both fear and respect into the hearts of everyone who crosses their path. Here in Homer, we have one of those legends. At the DMV. She's the driving test examiner, and she's not just known for being tough, she's known for failing people. Even if they've done everything perfectly. It's like it's her spiritual gift. Ask around town and you'll hear it. Oh, don't take your test in Homer. Nobody passes the first time. It's not a rumor. It's practically local doctrine. So, when my son was ready to take his test, we did what everyone does. We checked for appointments. And wouldn't you know it, Homer had the earliest available one. He didn't want to take it here. Honestly, neither did I. But it was that or wait like another month and go somewhere else. So we decided to risk it. And by we, I mean he didn't really want to take the test. I didn't really want to quietly stress eat in the car for 45 minutes. But here we are. Now, this examiner, she's not out to ruin lives or anything, but she takes her job seriously, like national security level seriously. And I've heard stories of people failing, having done everything perfectly. I have no feedback for you. You are a perfect driver. I'm going to fail you. She has a reputation and she knows it. So when my son went in for his test, I didn't even try to play it cool. I just prayed, Lord, if you can part the Red Sea, maybe you can part this woman's sense of judgment for 15 minutes. He drove off with her. I sat there in the DMV waiting room pretending to scroll on my phone, doing that parent thing where you act calm while your heart's doing burpees. About half hour later, they pulled back in. The examiner stepped out, stone-faced. My son followed. They walked in and we all got to talk about all the things that he did wrong. She started off by sharing. Kind of sounded like maybe she was going to pass him. And I was like, oh, this is cool. But then she was sharing like he was definitely going to fail. And then she said, I'm not worried about any of this stuff. He passed on the first try. And that, my friends, is no small miracle because that same examiner has known to fail people for being perfect. Now, I'm not exaggerating when I say this. She told me that in the 10 years of giving tests, that she has maybe passed about 20 teens on their first attempt. So naturally, I had to tell people. I wanted to tell everybody, dude, my son passed. You'll never believe it. It's incredible. When I told our pastor, he laughed. He's like, yeah, that's great for your son, but I'm still not taking my kids there. And I get it. I really, really do. He's seen the stats. He's heard the stories, and the reputation is what it is. But that conversation, it really stuck with me because it made me think, like, how often do we do the same thing with God? How often do we let someone else's story or a reputation or the odds keep us from even showing up to take the test? Sometimes we convince ourselves that failure is guaranteed before we've even put the car in drive. And yet, time and time again, God seems to love surprising us in the most unlikely places. So let's talk about that. Now, small towns run on reputations. Somebody opens a new restaurant, and by day 2, everyone's already decided whether it's worth going to. A store clerk has one bad day, and suddenly she's always rude. And if you're in Homer, you know, like news travels faster than the wind off Kachemak Bay. That's how reputations work. They grow legs, they run wild, and eventually they become truth in people's minds. The DMV Examiner had one. A reputation so strong, it could reroute road trips. People would literally drive the hour and a half one direction to Soldotna, or even go 4.5 hours clear to Anchorage just to avoid her. Because when someone has a track record of failure, it's hard to believe that your story could turn out any different. And that's not just a DMV thing, like that's a human thing. We do it in relationships and work and faith. We build our expectations around patterns, around what's already happened to us or to the people we know. Prayer didn't work for me last time. I've tried to change, but it never sticks. People like me don't get those kinds of opportunities. It's amazing how quickly we build invisible fences around our hope. We call them wisdom or being realistic, but sometimes they're just well-disguised fear. The irony is, reputations often outlive reality. They become these old stories we keep repeating, even when God's already moved on and done something new. That DMV Examiner, her reputation was solidly the dream crusher. But in that moment, on that random Wednesday morning, she showed mercy. She passed a teenager who, statistically speaking, shouldn't have stood a chance. And it made me realize how easily we underestimate people and God. There's a story in John chapter 1 about a man named Nathanael. When his friend Philip tells him, "We found the Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth," Nathanael's response is almost sarcastic. "Can anything good come from Nazareth?" That one sentence says everything about reputation. Nazareth wasn't exactly known for producing greatness. It was a small, unimpressive town, kind of like Homer, kind of like the Homer DMV of biblical geography even. But that's where God chose to begin the greatest story in all of history. Because God has this beautiful habit of hiding his best work in places that don't have great reputations. The overlooked, the ordinary, the written off. Maybe that's because he knows we'd miss it otherwise. If Jesus had come from Jerusalem, we'd credit the city. If David had come from royalty, we'd credit the bloodline. If Gideon had led a massive army, we'd credit the numbers. But when something beautiful emerges from a place no one expects, we have no choice but to credit grace. You know, it's funny. After my son passed, the whole family celebrated. We were just overjoyed, so proud of my son. But I couldn't stop thinking about that examiner. Like, how many people had already decided what she would or wouldn't do, and how, at least that day, she surprised absolutely everyone. Made me wonder, how often does God surprise us? But we're too busy steering clear of him to notice. We avoid prayer because we think we already know the outcome. We skip forgiveness because we just assume they'll hurt us again. We stop asking for healing or provision or reconciliation because the odds look terrible. And in doing that, we sometimes miss the very thing God is ready to bless. Because maybe grace doesn't live where we expect it to. Maybe it lives right in the place we swore we'd never try again. The DMV in Homer isn't exactly a holy site, but for me, last Wednesday morning, it became a small, ridiculous parable about God's mercy. It reminded me that he doesn't operate on human statistics or personal reputations. He operates on his character, and his character is good. It's kind. It's consistent. It's patient enough to let us circle the parking lot of doubt again and again until we finally put the car in drive. So maybe that's the question for you today. Where have you let reputation replace reality? Where have you let someone else's story or even your own past convince you that God won't show up there? Because if he can bring beauty out of Nazareth, he can pass a nervous teenager in Homer. He can meet you right where you are too. You might be avoiding something that's actually waiting to become your victory story. And that brings us to something even deeper, because it's not just that God works in spite of the odds. It's that he doesn't even check them. He breaks patterns on purpose. He doesn't read the statistics before showing up. God doesn't care about all that, because grace is the statistic breaker. Now, here's what I've noticed about grace. It doesn't care about math. It doesn't sit down with a calculator, run the numbers, and decide if you're worth the investment. Grace doesn't check the odds. It just shows up. That's what makes it so uncomfortable, because we like things to make sense. We like predictable outcomes, measurable success, clear reasons. Grace doesn't play by those rules. You can see it all throughout Scripture. When God picked David to face Goliath, nobody said, "Yeah, that seems like a solid matchup." The guy was a shepherd, not a soldier. No armor, no experience, just a sling and a weird amount of confidence in God. And yet, that's the one God chose. When Gideon went into battle, God actually shrunk his army on purpose just to make sure the victory couldn't be explained by numbers. When Mary was chosen to carry Jesus, she was a teenage girl from a town so small it barely registered on the map. She didn't have the resume, the reputation, or the resources, but she had willingness, and that was enough. Every one of those stories is a reminder that grace doesn't care about how many people failed before you. It only cares about that you showed up with faith. That's what I saw in my son that day. He didn't overthink it. He didn't obsess over the stats or the stories. He just showed up, took the test, and trusted that what he'd practiced was enough. And honestly, I needed that reminder, because I've got areas in my own life where I've quietly stopped believing God will move. Not because I doubt him, but because I've started to believe the odds. You know that feeling, like where you've prayed about something for so long that it's easier to stop praying than to risk another letdown. Maybe for you, it's not a test or a dream. Maybe it's your marriage, your finances, or maybe your faith itself. In the statistics, the experience, the realistic voices, they say it's probably not going to change, but grace doesn't read statistics. It writes stories. When I look back on my own life, some of the best things that have ever happened to me started as bad odds. Jobs I wasn't qualified for. Heck, the one I'm in right now. Friendships that should have fizzled. You know, if I put 3,000 miles between me and another guy, you'd think that maybe we wouldn't still try to talk every week. Maybe it's opportunities that didn't make sense. Even this podcast. There were so many reasons not to start it. And yet here we are. Because grace doesn't need a favorable forecast to start something beautiful. And we serve a God who delights in the unlikely. He loves the moments when the world says that's not going to work, and he whispers, "Yeah, watch me." That's why Paul says in 1 Corinthians that God chooses the foolish things to shame the wise and the weak things to shame the strong. It's not random, it's intentional. Because when the odds are stacked against us, his glory becomes unmistakable. Like if David had been a champion warrior, we'd remember his victory as skill. If Gideon had gone into battle with 30,000 troops, we'd call it great leadership. And if Mary had been royalty, we'd probably just chalk it up to privilege. Instead, we're left with one explanation: God. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the situations in our lives that look unwinnable aren't barriers, they're invitations. Invitations for God to show up in a way that makes it crystal clear he's the one behind it. When you think about it, the entire gospel is built on impossible odds. A perfect savior dying for imperfect people. A cross becoming a symbol of life? A sealed tomb opening 3 days later? There's nothing logical about it, and yet that's what makes it beautiful. Because the moment grace starts making sense, it stops being grace. I think sometimes we miss miracles because we're too busy counting the odds instead of trusting the God who defies them. We look at our situations like spreadsheets, columns of failure, probability, and risk, and we forget that heaven doesn't use Excel. God isn't checking data points. He's checking hearts. He's looking for faith that says, I know this doesn't make sense, but I'm showing up anyway. When my son took that test, there was no guarantee he'd pass. If anything, the odds said he wouldn't, but he showed up anyway. That's all grace needed. The examiner's reputation didn't change. She's still the same tough grader she has always been and will surely always be. But that day, something broke the pattern. Something unexpected happened. Something unexpected happened. And that's what grace does. It doesn't rewrite the person. It rewrites the moment. It steps into an environment that seems rigid, unforgiving, and impossible, and it turns it into a space for mercy. So maybe you're standing in front of your own DMV. Something intimidating, something that feels like it's just waiting for you to fail. Show up anyway. Even if the odds are bad, even if the reputation is ugly, even if everything in you says you're not worth trying again. Because grace loves those kinds of moments. Grace shows up where the odds look terrible and whispers, this one's mine. And that's where we're going to go next, because sometimes faith itself looks foolish. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is take the test when everyone else tells you not to. But those are the moments when God rewrites the stories no one sees coming. When I told our pastor that my son had passed his driving test in Homer, he laughed. He's like, well, it's great for you guys, but I'm still not taking my kids there. And honestly, I couldn't even argue with him, because on paper, he's absolutely right. The reputation still stands. The odds are still bad. It doesn't make sense to choose a harder road when an easier one exists. But sometimes faith does that. Sometimes faith looks foolish. Faith is what makes you apply for the job you don't qualify for. It's what makes you forgive someone who hasn't even apologized. It's what makes you pray when you've already prayed for years and nothing's changed. It's not logical. It's not safe. And it definitely doesn't always make sense. But here's the thing. Faith isn't supposed to make sense for everyone else. When Noah started building a massive boat on dry land, his neighbors thought he'd lost it. When Abraham packed up his family and started walking without knowing the destination, people probably whispered behind his back. When Peter stepped out of the boat and onto the waves, I'm sure the other disciples thought, Peter, hey, buddy, maybe just sit down before you drown. Faith always looks foolish until the flood comes, or the promise arrives, or Jesus reaches out his hand and says, come. The truth is, faith often walks straight into the places we've been told to avoid. Because faith isn't just belief, it's movement. It's trust with feet on it. My pastor's not wrong to avoid the Homer DMV. But sometimes what looks like wisdom can quietly morph into self-protection. And sometimes self-protection keeps us from seeing what God might be ready to do if we just show up one more time. I mean, if we all waited until the odds were perfect before doing anything, nobody would ever get married, start a business, or have kids. Because if you've ever calculated the success rate of those things, the numbers aren't exactly comforting. But we do them anyway, because something in us knows that love, calling, and purpose are worth the risk. And that's what faith really is. It's not denying the odds. It's choosing to trust God despite the odds. Hebrews 11 calls faith the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. It doesn't say the assurance of things guaranteed. Faith is conviction that God is still God, even when nothing adds up. Peter stepping out of the boat in Matthew 14 is such a vivid picture of this. The storm's raging, the waves are crashing, and Jesus is standing out there on top of it all, saying, "Come." Peter doesn't ask for a safety briefing or a personal flotation device. He just steps out. And for a moment, he does the impossible. Now, sure, he started to sink when he takes his eyes off Jesus, but before we judge him too harshly, let's remember, he's the only one who even tried. The rest of the disciples stayed in the boat, taking notes for their lessons on common sense. But Peter, he got to experience something the rest never did. He got to walk on water. That's the thing about faith. It looks foolish right up until the moment it works. And suddenly, everyone's asking how you did it. I think that's why God honors faith so deeply. Because faith isn't built on outcomes. It's built on obedience. It's not about how things turn out. It's about trusting who's calling you to step out in the first place. When you act in faith, you're not saying, "I know how this will end." You're saying, "I know who's in control of it." And that's what separates divine foolishness from worldly wisdom. One builds walls to stay safe. The other builds bridges to walk toward God. If my son had played it safe, he would have waited several more weeks for a test somewhere else. Maybe he still would have passed, but he also would have missed the story. He would have missed the moment where the odds lost and grace won. And honestly, isn't that what we all want? To see God do something that doesn't make sense? To watch him step into our story in a way that can't be explained by timing, effort, or luck. Maybe faith is foolish by design because it forces us to depend on something bigger than logic. When you step out in faith, when you risk obedience, you make room for God to be God. And the beautiful irony is that God rarely does things the same way twice. He's not interested in formulas. He's interested in hearts that trust him enough to take the next step, even when they can't see the next one after that. So maybe there's something in your life right now that feels risky, something that doesn't make sense on paper. Something that's pulling you out of the boat and into deeper water. Can I just say, don't let logic talk you out of faith. Don't let statistics talk you out of obedience. Don't let fear disguise itself as wisdom. Because sometimes the thing that looks foolish from the boat is actually where Jesus is standing, waiting for you to take one more step. And when you do, something incredible happens, because grace doesn't just help us pass the test. It reminds us that the pass was never earned in the first place. That's where we're going to be headed next, because the story doesn't end with faith being tested. It moves into the truth that everything we receive from God, every victory, every open door, every you passed, isn't something we earned. It's something we were given. When my son was standing there outside the DMV looking at me like, wait, I passed? I was so proud. Because if I'm being honest, I was also kind of stunned. Not because I didn't think he was capable. He's a good driver. He's practiced. He's prepared. We did parallel parking a ton. The kid nailed it every time. But when you go up against someone with a reputation for failing almost everyone, you just don't expect to hear the word pass. And I realized something in that moment. That's kind of how grace feels. You do your best. You try to follow the rules. You practice what you know. But at the end of the day, the pass isn't something you earned. It's something you were given. That examiner didn't have to pass him. She didn't owe him that. She didn't owe him anything. But for reasons known only to her, she did pass him. And that's what makes it grace. Now, I'm not saying the woman at the Homer DMV is a theological symbol of God's mercy, but let's just say I'm not ruling it out either. Because what happened that day has been preaching a quiet sermon in my heart ever since. We live in a world that runs on performance. You work, you earn. You prove, you achieve. You post, you compare. We are conditioned to believe that value is tied to what we can do. But then grace comes. This upside down, illogical, scandalous thing that says, you don't earn this, you just receive it. Ephesians 2 says, "For it is by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not from yourselves. It is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast." It's one of those verses we all know by heart, but still struggle to believe in our hearts. Because everything in us wants to contribute something to our salvation story. We want to point to the dashboard and say, see, I stayed in my lane. I used my blinker. I earned this. But grace looks at us and says, you passed because of the one sitting next to you. That's the wild part about following Jesus. You can be the best rule follower in the world and still miss the point if you think your performance is what earns his favor. Because the gospel isn't about our ability to drive perfectly. It's about his willingness to step in when we stall. When my son got home that day, he was proud too. He'd worked for it. He'd practiced that parallel parking between cones and cars, and the morning before the test, he's like, hey, before I go to school, I really want to practice parallel parking again. We ran down to the DMV. They've got some permanent cones set up there. But even he knew passing in Homer was a gift. There were better drivers who'd failed that test. More experienced teens who'd gotten nervous or made maybe some egregious mistake and heard the dreaded words, sorry, not this time. And that's exactly what makes grace so hard to wrap our heads around, because grace doesn't always line up with fairness. We want it to feel earned, but grace refuses to fit inside that box. It gives to those who don't deserve it. It blesses those who didn't qualify. It forgives those who failed again and again and again. Grace is the kid who parallel parks 3 feet from the curb and still gets their license. Okay, to be clear, that wasn't my son. He nailed it. That kid can parallel park like a champ. Better than most adults I know. Okay. If that bothers us a little, that grace is given like that, that's okay. It bothered the Pharisees too. They couldn't understand why Jesus kept giving passes to people who clearly didn't meet the standards, tax collectors, sinners, outsiders. And Jesus said, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. He wasn't lowering the bar. He was changing the system. He was showing us that grace doesn't come to those who have earned it. It comes to those humble enough to admit they can't earn it. And that realization does something to your heart. It humbles you. It softens you. It reminds you that every good thing you have, every answered prayer, every breakthrough, every bit of peace isn't the result of perfect performance. It's the result of perfect grace. But it also changes how you see other people. Because if I really believe that my pass wasn't earned, I lose the right to look down on anyone else who's still learning how to drive. It makes me patient with people's mistakes. It makes me gentle with their growth, because grace received should always become grace extended. Now, don't get me wrong. My son still has plenty to learn. He's a good driver. But my prayer life gets a little extra cardio when I'm in the passenger seat. Still, though, that moment at the DMV reminded me of something sacred. You can't pay back grace, but you can pass it on. That's what the kingdom of God looks like. People who were shown mercy, showing mercy. People who were forgiven, forgiving. People who were passing it forward. Because the real power of grace isn't just in being saved by it. It's in being shaped by it. It teaches you to stop performing for love and start living from it. To stop trying to prove yourself and start trusting that you're already accepted. So maybe the challenge for us isn't just to be grateful that we passed. Maybe it's to remember that the only reason we did is because Jesus took the test for us. He faced the impossible standard. He met every requirement. And then he handed us his scorecard. That's grace. And it's worth celebrating. But there's one more piece to this story, because sometimes grace doesn't just save us. It changes the pattern altogether. It turns reputations upside down. It creates space where none existed before. And that's where we'll land when God breaks the pattern. Because patterns are a powerful thing. They make us feel safe. They give us predictability and rhythm and control. We rely on them in almost every area of our life, our schedules, our relationships, even our expectations of God. But the longer I walk with him, the more I realize God is not afraid to break the pattern. Somebody told me one time, you can always make God laugh by telling him your plans. See, God's not bound by precedent or statistics on what usually happens. He's the God who parts seas, topples giants, opens tombs, and somehow, in a small town Homer, lets a teenager pass a driving test that almost nobody passes. Because that's what grace does. It breaks patterns. It steps into a story that's been heading one direction for years and says, we're going to turn here. And sometimes that turn is subtle. Maybe it's a slow change of heart, a quiet answer to prayer you almost missed. Other times it's shocking, a diagnosis reversed, a relationship restored, a burden lifted overnight. But either way, when grace moves, patterns fall apart. I think that's why God loves working in places like the Homer DMV or Nazareth. Because those are the places people have stopped expecting anything good to happen. And when something does happen there, everyone knows who to credit. No one walks out of that building saying, well, I guess the statistics were wrong. No, they walked out saying, oh, that shouldn't have happened, but it did. And that's the space where faith grows. Because when God breaks a pattern in your life, he's not just changing your circumstances, he's changing your perspective. He's teaching you that his goodness isn't limited by reputation. His mercy isn't rationed out according to merit. That his grace isn't predictable, but it's dependable. When I look back on my son's test now, it doesn't feel like a funny story or a proud dad moment. It feels like a small reminder of who God is. A God who shows up in the ordinary. A God who surprises us just enough to keep our faith awake. A God who says, you thought this was about a driving test, but really it's about me reminding you that I can still do the impossible. And I think that's something all of us need every now and then. A reminder that the story isn't as locked in as we think. Because maybe you've got an area in your life that feels stuck on repeat. You've prayed, you've tried, you've waited, and nothing's changed. That pattern feels permanent. But I want you to hear this. God can break it. He can rewrite what you've started to accept as unchangeable. He can redeem what feels repetitive. He can restore what's been resigned to that's just how it is. And sometimes the breakthrough doesn't look like a firework. It looks like faithfulness. It looks like getting up one more day and trusting that God's still writing, even when the page feels blank. Because every story of grace, every against all odds moment, starts with someone who decided to show up one more time. That's what my son did last week. He didn't know how it would go. He didn't feel confident in the system, but he showed up. And when he did, grace met him there. What if your next pass is waiting on the other side of just showing up again? Not because you've mastered it, not because you've earned it, but because God delights in breaking the pattern. Honestly, maybe it's the most spiritual thing we can do sometimes is to just take the test anyway. Even when everything and everyone says we shouldn't. Because when you do, you make space for a story that starts with "there's no way" and ends with "only God." And that's really the heartbeat of the gospel. It's a story that shouldn't have worked. Humanity failed the test. The odds were 0. But God broke the pattern. He stepped into our failure, took the test himself, passed it perfectly, and then handed us his results. That's what grace is. That's what salvation is. That's what every against all odds moment whispers back to us. This is who your God is. So if you're in a season where the odds look bad or the reputation looks grim or the pattern feels unbreakable, show up anyway. Don't let someone else's story convince you that yours is over. Don't let old patterns become permanent expectations, because the same God who changed the ending in Homer can change it for you too. And maybe years from now, you'll look back on the thing you were most afraid of and realize it was never really about passing the test. It was about learning to trust the one who already passed it for you. Because he is still the God who delights in defying expectations. He's still the God who gives grace to the undeserving. He's still the God who breaks the pattern. So don't give up. Don't count yourself out. Whatever the test is that you're standing in front of this week, remember, the odds don't scare God. Because when grace takes the wheel, even the impossible becomes possible. And remember, small ripples can make a big impact. So go make yours. Hey, before you go, I'd really love to hear from you. Whether this episode encouraged you or brought up a question or just made you think, you can actually send a message straight to us. It's an easy way to share your thoughts or your story or even just say hello. Just click the link in the episode description to reach out. I read every message and I'd be honored to hear how God's moving in your life.